Hello, I'm Alexandra Rose, Curator of Climate and Earth Sciences, and I'm here to tell you about the Great Theodolite. This intriguing instrument behind me is a theodolite, which is a surveying instrument for gathering the scientific data that sits behind maps. This was built in 1790, and it was used for a project with quite an unwieldy name, the Principal Triangulation of Great Britain. This was the foundation of what we now know today as the Ordnance Survey. The Principal Triangulation of Great Britain was a project that was designed to gather all of the scientific data that would go into the creation of the first accurate map of the nation. A theodolite is a surveying instrument that measures angles. They always measure horizontal angles. Some of them, like this one, can also measure vertical angles too. You might have seen contemporary theodolites on the street with surveyors taking measurements of the roads and landmarks around us, and this one admittedly looks a little bit different to that. This instrument was made by a man called Jesse Ramsden, who was a leading maker of scientific instruments at the end of the 18th century. He was based in London. His workshop was in Piccadilly. Ramsden was renowned for the quality of his scientific instruments, particularly large, complex instruments like these. But Ramsden's flaw was that he was a bit of a perfectionist, and he often didn't deliver his instruments on time or to budget. And that's quite significant when it comes to the story of this instrument. Originally, this theodolite was commissioned by the East India Company. They'd seen a previous theodolite that Ramsden had made, and they felt it would be really useful for the ambitious surveying project that they were carrying out in India at the time. But Ramsden wanted to make the instrument as perfect as possible, so he introduced a number of different modifications. He added more reading microscopes and made it as precise as he possibly could. But when he presented the finished instrument and the bill to the East India Company, it was more than they were prepared to pay. Fortunately for Ramsden, the Master General of the government's Board of Ordnance at the time, a man called Charles Lennox, was a mapping and surveying enthusiast, and he'd long aspired to create an accurate map of Britain. And he was very pleased to purchase the theodolite for the government's Board of Ordnance. So what were the motivations for creating an accurate map in the first place? Well, some of those motivations were military. The Board of Ordnance was the government's department for equipping the military, and a knowledge of a nation's landscape was really important for national security. This was particularly significant at the end of the 18th century because for a number of years there'd been revolutionary wars rumbling on in France, and some people feared that there could be an invasion. So accurately mapping the coastlines and also the interior was particularly important at this time. Another motivation, though, was that there had been a growing preoccupation throughout the 18th century with precision measurement and knowledge that was based on observation and reason. And an accurate map of the nation was a real expression of these ideals. The final motivation, and no less important, was a matter of national pride and prestige. Because for several decades, the French had themselves been creating an accurate map of France using triangulation. And there were people in Britain that felt that it wouldn't be right for an accurate map of France to exist if we didn't have an equivalent map in Britain. This project has a prehistory as well. The director of the Paris Observatory, Cassini de Thury, approached the Royal Society to see if there was any interest in extending the triangles across the Channel so as to connect the Paris Observatory with Greenwich Observatory and to accurately determine the relative positions of both of them. There was a slight suggestion the British perceived that he might be suggesting that the British astronomers' position of the Greenwich Observatory might be slightly wrong. But there was a benefit to both nations because this accurate data would enable the improvement of navigational data and the creation of astronomical charts. This project was carried out successfully as a collaboration between British and French astronomers and surveyors, and it was the inspiration for the British to conduct their own triangulation of the whole nation. So what is triangulation? It's a technique used by surveyors, and it's based on the relatively simple mathematics of a triangle. If you know all of the interior angles of a triangle and you know the length of one of the sides, you can calculate the lengths of the other two sides using trigonometry without having to measure them directly. And this is really useful if you're making a map, because it's much easier to take accurate measurements of angles than it is to directly measure distances across the ground. That's what the surveyors used this theodolite for. So they made one accurate measurement across the ground of what was known as a baseline. The surveyor's baseline was at Hounslow Heath, which is a little bit west of London. It's now almost entirely occupied by Heathrow Airport. The line was just over 5 miles long. Once they'd done that, they positioned the theodolite at one end of the baseline, and they sighted a distant landmark through the telescopic sight, and they measured the angle off the brass scale. Then they moved the theodolite to the other end of the baseline and did the same again with the same landmark. Having measured all of the angles, they could then calculate the lengths of the other two sides of their triangle without having to measure those distances directly. And then all they had to do was repeat that over and over and over again to create a skeleton of triangles that stretched across the whole country. And this provided the scientific data that was the basis of the accurate map of the nation. That might sound relatively straightforward in principle, but in practice it was quite challenging. For a start, when you're surveying over a whole country, you have to take into account the curvature of the Earth into your mathematics. In practice as well, operating the theodolite was quite challenging. In order to sight the distant landmarks that could be 5-10 miles away, the surveyors needed to have the theodolite at height. It had its own purpose-built scaffold that they would winch it to the top of before taking their measurements. Sometimes they would take it to the top of a church tower, and other times just to the top of a hill. But this was all very hard physical work. Another challenge, as you might imagine, in Britain was the weather. The surveyors reported, for example, having a horrible time trying to make their observations in the Isle of Wight, where it was foggy the whole time they were trying to make their measurements, which made them very challenging. The triangulation took a really long time. It started in the 1790s and didn't finish until the 1850s, and all the time the theodolite had to be transported across the whole country. The publication of the maps took even longer. But the project had some really important legacies. This was the first time that the whole nation had been accurately surveyed using triangulation, and the data continued to be used until the 1930s. Let's take a closer look at the instrument itself. The first thing that we can see is that it's really quite big. So across the base, it's 3 foot across, which is about 1 meter, and it weighs a massive 90 kilograms. We can see there's a large horizontal brass scale on the large base of the instrument. And if you look really closely, you can see the numbers very faintly engraved on the scale. There are microscopes for taking really accurate readings on the scale. And then we can also see further up that there's a vertical scale as well, so you could measure vertical angles too. And right on the top, there's a telescopic sight, which the surveyors could look through to spot things in the far distance. To our modern eyes, thinking about scientific instruments today, it perhaps looks quite ornate, but it was designed to be very functional. Surveying technologies today, involving satellites and GPS, are a far cry from this theodolite. But when we look at this instrument, we get a real visceral sense of the human labour and the human toil that went into the production of the first accurate map of the nation. Thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed this, please like and subscribe to our YouTube channel.